Long before Iran became a name that sends shivers down the spine of nations, it was whispered in the chambers of eternity. What if I told you that every missile launched, every threat uttered, every alliance forged between Iran and Israel today was already written, not in the war rooms of Tehran, not in the strategy centers of Jerusalem, but in the sacred scrolls of prophets who saw tomorrow before yesterday even existed? You've watched the headlines. You felt the tension crawling across your television screen. Iran's nuclear ambitions, Israel's existential dread, the world holding its breath, waiting for the spark that could ignite everything. But what if this isn't just geopolitics? What if this is prophecy? Hidden in plain sight, across 2,500 years of biblical text, lies a blueprint so precise, so chilling, that scholars who discover it can barely sleep at night. The ancient name wasn't Iran, it was Persia. And Persia was chosen, first to deliver God's people, then to threaten them, and finally, to fulfill something so dark, so inevitable, that it was sealed in the visions of exile prophets who wept as they wrote it down. From the palace courts where Queen Esther risked her life, to the prayer chambers where Daniel saw spiritual wars raging over Persian skies. From the decrees of Cyrus the Great who rebuilt Jerusalem, to the coming war of Gog and Magog where Persia marches again. This isn't coincidence. This is covenant. This is destiny. This is the unfolding of a divine script written before the first Persian king ever drew breath. Tonight, as you sit in the comfort of your home, know this: you are not watching random world events. You are witnessing the final act of a drama that began in the Garden of Eden. Every news alert from the Middle East is another verse coming to life. Every diplomatic failure, another prophecy being fulfilled, and every threat from Iran, another page turning in the book that Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah wrote with trembling hands. But here's what will shake you to your core. The same biblical scroll that reveals Iran's past as Israel's deliverer and predicts its future as Israel's great threat, also whispers of something else, something that most have never seen, something hidden in the final verses that speaks of restoration, of revival, of redemption even for those who rage against Zion. The question that will haunt you after tonight is this: are we living in the days when ancient Persia becomes end times Iran? And if we are, what does that mean for you, for your children, for the church that has fallen asleep while prophecy awakens? Because the God who once used Persia to rebuild Jerusalem may be preparing to use Iran to reveal himself to the world one final time. The scroll is opening, the seal is breaking, and what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the times we're living in. Before kingdoms were born, two sons walked east with prophecy pulsing in their blood. In the beginning, after the waters of judgment receded and the earth drew its first clean breath, God scattered the nations like seeds across the soil of time. Each name spoken from the lips of Moses carried within it the DNA of destiny. Each bloodline bore the weight of tomorrow's headlines. And hidden among those ancient genealogies, tucked between the verses that most skip over, were two names that would one day reshape the Middle East: Madai, Elam. You've never heard their stories told this way. But tonight, you will understand that the Iran threatening Israel in your evening news was conceived not in the minds of modern mullahs, but in the tents of Noah's grandsons, when the world was still young and prophecy was being planted like seeds in virgin ground. Turn with me to Genesis 10, the forgotten chapter that holds the blueprints of nations. Here, in what scholars call the Table of Nations, we find the first whisper of Persia. From Japheth, Noah's son who inherited the northern lands, came a descendant named Madai. From Shem, the blessed line, came another named Elam, two branches, two bloodlines, two destinies that would intertwine across the centuries, like DNA strands in the helix of divine purpose. Madai's children became the Medes Mountain warriors who carved kingdoms from stone and snow in the rugged highlands of what we now call northwestern Iran. They were a people forged by altitude and adversity, their hearts as hard as the peaks they called home. When other nations built temples in valleys, the Medes built altars on mountaintops. When others sought comfort, they sought conquest. Elam's descendants settled in the southwestern region, where rivers kissed fertile plains and ancient trade routes pulsed like arteries through the heart of civilization. They became master craftsmen, skilled in metallurgy and warfare, their cities rising like jewels along the Persian Gulf. While the Medes commanded mountains, the Elamites commanded commerce. But here's what will stop your heart. These weren't just random tribal migrations. This was strategic positioning by the hand of eternity. God was placing chess pieces on a board that wouldn't see its endgame for thousands of years. What if the conflict we see today was conceived before the first sword was ever forged? Consider this. Abraham, the father of Israel, would one day encounter the Elamites in battle. Genesis 14 records how Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, marched west with his coalition and took Lot captive. Think about that moment. The ancestors of modern Iran were already crossing swords with the family of promise before Isaac was even born. The spiritual tension between Persia and Israel wasn't born in 1979 or 1948. It was written into the very foundation stones of human history. And Abraham, that ancient warrior priest, pursued them with 318 trained men of his household. Under cover of darkness, he struck Elam and rescued his nephew. The first recorded battle between the seed of Abraham and the sons of Elam ended in victory for the covenant people. A pattern was being established. A precedent was being set. God's people and Persia's ancestors would dance this dance of conflict and deliverance again and again across the stages of history. But there's something deeper here, something that will shake you if you have eyes to see it. The Medes and Elamites weren't just neighboring tribes, they were complementary forces. Mountain and valley, highland and lowland, iron and gold. When they eventually united under the banner of Cyrus, they didn't just form another empire. They became an instrument in the hand of God so precise, so perfectly calibrated, that Isaiah would call their king anointed more than a century before he was born. The same bloodlines that battled Abraham would one day liberate Abraham's children from Babylonian captivity. The same soil that drank the blood of ancient warfare would later echo with the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. This is how God writes history, not in straight lines, but in spirals that return to the same themes with deeper meaning, higher stakes, and greater glory. Look at the geography itself and tremble. Iran sits at the crossroads of continents, the bridge between East and West, the gateway between Asia and the Middle East. Every empire that ever mattered had to reckon with Persian soil. Every trade route that ever carried wealth had to negotiate with Persian power. This wasn't accidental. This was architectural. God was building a stage for the drama of redemption, and Persia was center stage. The mountains that shaped the Medes gave them strategic advantage. The valleys that nourished the Elamites gave them economic leverage. Combined, they possessed everything an empire needed: natural barriers for defense, fertile ground for agriculture, mineral wealth for weapons, and geographic position to control the flow of nations. But most importantly, they possessed something else, a role in the unfolding scroll of Scripture that would make them both savior and threat, deliverer and destroyer, instrument of mercy and weapon of judgment. From the same soil would rise Cyrus, the liberator, and the coalition of Gog and Magog. From the same bloodline would come the rebuilders of Jerusalem and the armies that would one day march against her. Tonight, as Iranian leaders speak of wiping Israel from the map, they're not just voicing political rhetoric, they're echoing an ancient enmity that pulses in their spiritual DNA. When they fund terror proxies and build nuclear weapons, they're not just pursuing regional dominance. They're fulfilling patterns established when the world was young and prophecy was being encoded into the very bedrock of civilization. The sons who walked east carried more than their possessions, they carried destiny. And that destiny is still unfolding on your television screen, still shaping the headlines that keep you awake at night, still moving like a slow earthquake toward the climax that Daniel saw in visions and Ezekiel recorded in trembling script. But bloodlines do not sleep forever, and prophecy never forgets a name. Before Cyrus ever breathed, heaven had already spoken his name. Picture this: a prophet stands in the shadow of Jerusalem's ruins, his voice trembling as words pour from his lips that he himself cannot fully comprehend. The year is 700 BC. Babylon has not yet risen to devour Israel. Persia is nothing more than scattered tribes in distant mountains. And yet, Isaiah opens his mouth and speaks a name that will not echo through history for another century and a half. Cyrus. Not just any name, not just any king, but a pagan ruler from a land that doesn't even exist yet, whom God calls my anointed. Do you understand what just happened? The same title reserved for David, for Solomon, for the sacred kings of Israel Mashiach, the anointed one, was placed upon the head of a Persian emperor who had not yet been born, in a kingdom that had not yet been formed, for a purpose that would not unfold for 6 generations. This is not prophecy. This is precision. This is the divine architect revealing blueprints that human eyes were never meant to see. Isaiah 45:1 burns with impossible specificity. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him. The Hebrew word for grasped here means to seize with intimate strength, like a father taking his child's hand to guide them across dangerous ground. God reached across the centuries and took hold of a king who existed only in eternity's imagination. But why? Why would the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob anoint a pagan? Why would the Holy One of Israel crown a Gentile with sacred oil that had touched no forehead but Hebrew kings? Because sometimes the most shocking acts of deliverance come through the most unexpected hands. Fast forward 150 years. Babylon has risen. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple lies in ash. The people of promise sit by foreign rivers, weeping songs they can no longer sing. 70 years of exile have passed, just as Jeremiah prophesied. And then, from the eastern mountains, comes a conqueror whose name had been whispered in sacred scrolls before his great-great-grandfather was even conceived. Cyrus the Great steps onto the stage of history with the force of destiny itself. His armies sweep across nations like a divine wind. Media falls, Lydia crumbles. And then, in a single night that will echo through eternity, the unconquerable walls of Babylon are breached, not by battering rams, but by the very hand of God opening gates that should have remained sealed forever. Daniel had seen it coming. In the candlelit chambers of Babylonian power, the aged prophet watched heaven's finger write doom across palace walls, while the empire's elite drank from vessels stolen from God's house. That very night, as the last Babylonian king breathed his final breath, Persian soldiers marched through gates left mysteriously unbarred. But this was not conquest. This was orchestration. What happened next defies every pattern of ancient warfare. Victorious armies were supposed to enslave the conquered, burn their temples, erase their gods. Instead, Cyrus did something that sent shockwaves across the ancient world. He opened the prison doors, not just for some, for all. And not just for freedom, for restoration. Listen to the decree that thundered from Persian lips in Ezra 1-2-3. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and build the temple of the Lord. A pagan king, acknowledging the God of Israel, a Persian emperor, funding the rebuilding of the very temple his armies could have destroyed. A Gentile ruler, becoming the unlikely bridge between exile and return, between mourning and dancing, between the rubble of judgment and the cornerstone of restoration. This was not political calculation. This was prophetic fulfillment, unfolding line by line, as Isaiah had seen it in the fire of divine vision. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. Every gate that had held God's people captive swung open at the approach of his anointed, his Persian anointed. Do you see the mystery here? Do you grasp the staggering scope of what just occurred? The same Persia that now threatens Israel in our headlines was once the very instrument of Israel's deliverance. The same soil that breeds today's enemies of Zion once nurtured the king who restored Zion's foundations. Cyrus didn't just free the captives, he honored them. He didn't just permit their return, he financed it. Silver and gold flowed from Persian treasuries to fund what Babylonian fire had consumed. Horses and camels carried not just refugees home, but the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from Solomon's temple. Picture the moment. Tens of thousands of exiles, faces streaked with tears of joy they had forgotten how to cry, walking the same roads their grandparents had traveled in chains. In their hands, the golden cups and silver bowls that had once caught the light in the Holy of Holies. Behind them, Persian wagons loaded with timber and stone for the house their enemies had burned. This was more than return. This was resurrection. But here's what should haunt every student of Scripture. The same land that God used to rebuild Jerusalem will one day, according to prophecy, seek to destroy it. The same Persia that carried Israel home will march against Israel in the war of Gog and Magog. The deliverer will become the destroyer. How does a nation go from being called God's anointed to being numbered among God's enemies? How does the shepherd become the wolf? How does the hand that builds become the fist that strikes? Could it be that every kingdom, every leader, every nation stands at the same crossroads Cyrus faced? The choice between submission and rebellion, between carrying out heaven's purpose or pursuing earth's pride, between remaining a vessel of honor or becoming a tool of destruction? And here's the question that should pierce your heart tonight. Could God still use the unexpected hand to carry out a holy purpose? Could the nations you fear most become the instruments of deliverance you never saw coming? Could enemies become allies? And could the very powers that threaten God's people be transformed into their protectors? Because if Cyrus teaches us anything, it's that God's sovereignty is not limited by human understanding, national boundaries, or religious labels. His purposes are not confined to those who acknowledge him. His plans are not dependent on the cooperation of the consecrated. The God who moved through pagan Persia to restore his temple can move through any heart, any throne, any nation to accomplish his will. The question is not whether he can. The question is whether he will. But prophecy is not status it watches to see what kings will do with the oil poured on their heads. He built a noose for the Jews, but God wrote a reversal. What if I told you that the hatred burning in the speeches of Tehran today was first kindled in the palace chambers of ancient Persia, that the very words chanted in the streets death to Israel are echoes of a rage that began 2,500 years ago in the heart of a man whose name still whispers through the corridors of evil? His name was Haman, and he built gallows for God's people. But before we enter his darkness, you must understand something that will chill you to the bone. This wasn't just palace politics. This wasn't mere anti-Semitism. This was the first recorded attempt at what we now call genocide, the systematic extermination of an entire people. And it happened in Persia, the same soil that today calls itself Iran. The year was 473 BC. The Persian Empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, the greatest kingdom the world had ever seen. In the glittering capital of Susa, King Xerxes, known in the Hebrew text as Ahasuerus, ruled over 127 provinces from a throne of ivory and gold. The empire was vast, wealthy, and seemingly unstoppable. But in the shadows of that palace walked a man consumed by an ancient hatred, Haman the Agagite. The text doesn't merely call him a court official. It identifies his lineage, Agagite linking him to Agag, the Amalekite king, whom Saul was commanded to destroy, but spared. This is no coincidence. The Amalekites were the first to attack Israel after the Exodus, and God declared eternal war against them. In Haman, that ancient enmity found a new vessel, a new voice, a new opportunity for annihilation. When Mordecai the Jew refused to bow before Haman, something demonic awakened. The text says Haman was filled with fury, but this wasn't ordinary anger. This was the rage of hell itself, frustrated that God's people still breathed, still believed, still carried the promise of Messiah in their bloodline. And here's what should terrify you. Haman's solution was not to punish Mordecai alone. Esther 3-6 records his chilling decree. He sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. All of them, every man, woman, and child. A final solution. The lots were cast. Purim in Persianto, choose the date of slaughter. The 13th day of Adar. The decree went out, sealed with the king's ring, irrevocable according to Persian law. Across the empire, from the Indus River to the shores of Africa, every Jewish soul was marked for death. Can you imagine the terror? Can you feel the despair that must have settled over every Jewish household? They had survived Babylon's exile, witnessed the temple's restoration, and now faced complete extinction in the very empire that had delivered them. but God is never caught off guard. While Haman schemed in the palace halls, heaven had already positioned its answer. Her name was Hadassah, called Esther, Jewish orphan who had become queen of Persia. She didn't ascend that throne by accident. She didn't win the king's heart by chance. From before the foundation of the world, God had ordained that this young woman would stand between her people and annihilation. When Mordecai sent word of Haman's plot, Esther faced the most terrible choice in history. She could remain silent, hide her identity, and perhaps survive. Or she could risk everything: her crown, her life, her future, to intercede for her people. The words Mordecai sent to her still echo through the chambers of every crisis. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? For such a time as this, 5 words that have sustained the persecuted through every dark hour since. 5 words that whisper to every believer who faces impossible odds: you are not here by accident. Esther called for a fast. 3 days and 3 nights. No food, no water. She wasn't just preparing for a political audience. She was entering spiritual warfare. She was stepping into the gap between death and deliverance, between the enemy's plans and God's purposes. And then she did the unthinkable. She approached the throne uninvited, an act that carried the penalty of death. But as she entered the inner court, clothed in royal robes but sustained by desperate faith, the king extended his golden scepter. Grace met courage, mercy kissed bravery. What followed was not just a banquet, it was a masterpiece of divine timing. Esther didn't rush. She didn't panic. She invited the king and Haman to feast with her, not once, but twice. She waited for the moment when God would move, when heaven would act, when the trap would spring. That night, the king couldn't sleep, so he called for the royal chronicles to be read and discovered that Mordecai had once saved his life, but never been rewarded. The next morning, in a twist of irony that only God could orchestrate, Haman was forced to parade Mordecai through the streets, proclaiming honor to the very man he'd planned to hang. But the reversal was just beginning. At the second banquet, when the king asked what Esther desired, she revealed her true identity and Haman's genocidal plot. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be granted me for my petition, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king's fury was immediate and terrible. Haman fell before Esther, begging for mercy from the woman whose people he had condemned to death. But justice was already in motion. On the very gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, 75 feet high, constructed for maximum humiliation, Haman himself was hanged. The hunter became the hunted. The executioner met his own execution. The gallows meant for God's people became the grave of their enemy. But here's what will shake you. The spirit that moved through Haman didn't die on those gallows. It didn't perish with his body. That ancient hatred, that demonic rage against God's chosen people, simply found new vessels, new voices, new opportunities. Through the centuries, it whispered to pharaohs and Caesars, to crusaders and commissars. It breathed through the speeches of Hitler, the policies of Stalin, the rhetoric of every regime that ever raised its fist against the Jewish people. And today, in the chambers of Tehran, that same spirit speaks again. When Iran's leaders chant death to Israel, when they deny the Holocaust while plotting another, when they fund terror and build weapons of mass destruction, they are not creating something new. They are channeling something ancient. The spirit of Haman lives. The gallows he built still cast their shadow across the Persian landscape. The lots he cast for genocide are being rolled again in the form of missiles and proxies, nuclear programs and apocalyptic theology. But remember this: the God who turned Haman's plot into his own destruction is the same God who watches over Israel today. The same divine hand that elevated Esther to the throne for such a time as this is still moving through history, still positioning his people, still writing reversals in the darkest hours. What if the gallows of yesterday are indeed the headlines of today? What if every threat against Israel is just another Haman building another scaffold? What if every scheme against God's people is just another opportunity for heaven to display its power? The question is not whether God can deliver. He already has, again and again. The question is whether we, like Esther, will have the courage to step into our moment, to fast and pray, to intercede for such a time as this. Because the spirit that whispered in Haman's heart has indeed begun to breathe again through new mouths. But the God who hung him on his own gallows is sharpening the blade of justice once more. And the story that began in a Persian palace is far from finished. Daniel fasted, but the heavens were at war. There are prayers that move mountains, and then there are prayers that shake the very foundations of invisible kingdoms. Daniel was about to discover the difference. Picture this: an old man by a river, weathered hands folded in desperate intercession. 3 weeks of mourning, 3 weeks of seeking, 3 weeks of silence from heaven. No choice food had touched his lips. No wine had wet his throat. No oils had anointed his aging skin. Just the ache of unanswered prayer and the weight of his people's future pressing down like a stone upon his chest. But what Daniel couldn't see, what mortal eyes were never meant to witness, was that his prayer had triggered a war in the heavens the moment it left his lips. The vision that finally came would change everything we thought we knew about the nature of nations, the reality of spiritual warfare, and the true power behind the thrones of earth. In Daniel chapter 10, the veil between two worlds doesn't just thin, it tears completely apart. A being of terrifying brilliance stood before him, face like lightning, eyes like flaming torches, voice like the sound of a multitude. This was no ordinary messenger. This was a warrior, battle-scarred from combat in realms we cannot fathom. And the words he spoke to Daniel would echo through every news cycle, every diplomatic crisis, every threat that would ever emerge from the land we now call Iran. Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. Pause. Let that sink into the depths of your spirit. For 21 days, this angelic emissary had been locked in spiritual combat with a dark territorial prince. Not a human ruler, not a political figure, a prince. A spiritual entity so powerful, so entrenched in the corridors of Persian power, that even heaven's messenger required supernatural reinforcement to break through. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't poetry. This was revelation of the highest order. Heaven had just pulled back the curtain on the invisible war raging behind every earthly kingdom, and Persia, ancient Persia, was not just a political empire, it was a spiritual battleground. The Prince of Persia was real, he was territorial, he was resistant to God's purposes, and according to this divine intelligence report, he was still actively opposing the plans of heaven for God's people. Think about the staggering implications. While Cyrus was making his decree to rebuild Jerusalem, invisible forces were fighting for influence over his heart. While Esther was walking into the throne room to save her people, spiritual principalities were warring over the fate of an empire. Every political decision, every royal proclamation, every shift in Persian policy toward Israel was the result of battles fought in dimensions we cannot see. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. Michael, the archangel, God's military commander, had to personally intervene in this conflict. That's how significant, how intense, how cosmic this spiritual war over Persia truly was. The fate of Israel, the timeline of prophecy, the very purposes of God hung in the balance of this invisible battle above the Persian Empire. And here's what should send chills down your spine. If the Prince of Persia was real then, if spiritual forces were influencing earthly kingdoms then, what makes you think that dynamic has changed? Fast forward to today. Iran, modern Persia, once again stands as the greatest state-level threat to Israel's existence. Iranian leaders don't just speak of military strategy, they speak with a spiritual fervor that borders on the demonic. They don't simply oppose Israel's politics, they rage against her very right to exist, as if driven by forces beyond mere human hatred. Could it be that the same territorial spirit that once delayed angelic messengers is still operating? Could it be that the Prince of Persia never truly fell, but simply adapted, evolved, and continued his ancient assignment to resist God's purposes for his chosen people? Daniel's 3 weeks of prayer didn't just move heaven, it exposed the spiritual infrastructure behind earthly empires. It revealed that nations are not merely political entities, they are spiritual battlegrounds where invisible kingdoms clash over the fate of humanity. Every time you see Iran in the headlines threatening Israel, remember Daniel by the river. Every time you hear the chants of death to Israel echoing from Tehran, remember the Prince of Persia. Every time you wonder why this particular conflict feels so ancient, so spiritual, so inevitable, remember that this war was never really about land or oil or politics. It was always about prophecy. It was always about covenant. It was always about a spiritual prince who has been assigned to resist the promises of God for over 2 millennia. But Daniel's story doesn't end in delay. It ends in breakthrough. Heaven doesn't lose battles, it only waits for the right moment to reveal its victory. And the same God who sent Michael to break through Persian resistance is still sending help to those who fast, who pray, and who understand that the battles that matter most are fought on their knees. What if your prayers for Israel aren't just wishful thinking? What if your intercession for peace in the Middle East actually moves pieces on a cosmic chessboard you've never seen? What if every time you cry out for Jerusalem, you're entering the same spiritual war that Daniel fought and won beside that ancient river? The Prince of Persia may still stand, but so does the Prince of Peace. And the kingdom that will ultimately prevail was decided long before the first Persian king ever drew breath. But Persia's prince was not finished, and neither was prophecy. From the ruins of Babylon, silver rose to power. In the trembling hours before dawn, when kingdoms hold their breath and empires teeter on the edge of tomorrow, there are moments when heaven pulls back the veil. Moments when the Almighty whispers secrets to sleeping kings through dreams so vivid, so terrifying, that they wake with their hearts pounding against their ribs like caged birds. Such was the night when Nebuchadnezzar, the golden king of Babylon, saw the future of the world. Picture it, the most powerful man on earth, the one who had crushed Jerusalem and dragged God's people into chains, tosses restlessly on his royal bed. His empire stretches from the Euphrates to the Nile. His armies are without equal. His palaces gleam with the spoils of conquered nations. But in his dreams, he sees something that makes his blood run cold. A statue, towering, terrible, beautiful, and horrifying all at once. Its head gleams with the purest gold, magnificent, blinding, supreme. But as his dreaming eyes travel downward, the vision shifts. The chest and arms are made of silver, still precious, still powerful, but no longer supreme. Below that, bronze, then iron. And finally, feet of clay mixed with iron, crumbling, fracturing, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. When morning breaks, the king's soul is in torment. He knows he has seen something beyond the natural realm, something that reaches into the corridors of eternity. But the dream slips away like water through his fingers, leaving only the echo of dread in his chest. "Tell me what I dreamed," he commands his wise men. "If you cannot, you will all die." But there is one among the captives, a young Hebrew exile named Daniel, a man who walks so closely with the God of heaven that secrets whisper themselves into his spirit. And when Daniel stands before the trembling king, he speaks words that will echo through every generation until the end of time. "Your Majesty," Daniel's voice carries the weight of divine revelation, "you are the head of gold. You, Babylon, are the first kingdom. But after you, another kingdom will arise inferior to yours, represented by the chest and arms of silver." Silver. Do you hear that? In the throne room of Babylon, while the golden empire still blazed in its glory, God was already announcing its replacement. The silver chest and arms, 2 arms, because this coming empire would not be one nation, but 2, Media and Persia, 2 ancient peoples who would unite under one crown to become the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But here's what should make your spirit tremble. This wasn't prophecy being spoken into the unknown. This was God reading from a scroll he had already written. Before Cyrus the Great took his first breath, his name was already whispered in the courts of heaven. Before the Medes and Persians ever dreamed of conquest, their rise and fall had already been mapped in the mind of the Eternal. Isaiah would later write words that still echo like thunder across the centuries. "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him." The prophet spoke those words over a century before Cyrus was even born. A century before he conquered a single city. a century before he ever heard the name of Israel. What kind of God operates like this? What kind of divine mind orchestrates history with such precision that he names kings before their mothers conceive them? And what does it mean for us today as we watch Iran dominate headlines, threaten Israel, and position itself as the great enemy of God's chosen people? Because the silver kingdom that Daniel saw, the Medo-Persian Empire that was ancient Iran, the same soil, the same bloodlines, the same spiritual battleground. Let that sink into your soul for a moment. The Iran that we see on our television screens, launching missiles and funding terror, is the same region that God once called my anointed. The same land that produced Cyrus, who rebuilt Jerusalem. The same people who preserved the Jewish exiles when Babylon sought to destroy them. But silver does not last forever. Daniel's interpretation continues, and his words carry the weight of divine judgment. After you will arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. The statue reveals not just Persia's rise, but Persia's fall. The silver arms are glorious, but they are not eternal. Greece would rise like a bronze tsunami, sweeping away Persian power in a matter of years. Alexander the Great, that Macedonian whirlwind, would shatter the silver kingdom like a hammer striking crystal. And beyond Greece, Rome, Iron Rome, crushing everything beneath its legions. But here's the mystery that should keep you awake at night. Daniel saw something else. He saw that after iron would come something strange, something unprecedented. Feet of iron mixed with clay, partly strong, partly brittle. A final kingdom that would arise in the last days, attempting to unite but never truly cohering. Do you know where we are on the statue? Think about it. Babylon, the head of gold, fell to Persia. Persia, the silver arms, fell to Greece. Greece, the bronze belly, fell to Rome. Rome, the iron legs, dominated for 1,000 years before fracturing into the nations of Europe. And now we live in the time of the feet. The time when kingdoms try to unite but cannot hold together. The time when iron attempts to mix with clay but only creates instability. The time when ancient empires stir again, when old hatreds resurface, when the children of Persia once again set their faces toward Jerusalem. But the statue had one more revelation, one final, earth-shattering truth that Daniel could barely speak aloud. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. That rock, that stone cut without human hands, that is the kingdom of God, breaking into history with such force that every human empire from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome to whatever rises in our day will be swept away like dust before the wind. We are living in the shadow of that moment. Every headline from Iran, every threat against Israel, every alliance and treaty and nuclear negotiation is simply the final positioning of pieces on the board before the rock falls from heaven. The silver kingdom rose precisely when God ordained it. It fell exactly when he decreed it. And its children, modern Iran, are playing their prophetic role with stunning accuracy, setting the stage for the final confrontation between the kingdoms of men and the kingdom of heaven. Nebuchadnezzar's dream wasn't just about ancient empires. It was about you, about this moment, about this generation that has the privilege and the terror of watching the feet of iron and clay crumble beneath the weight of divine judgment. Because after silver came bronze, iron, and something not yet fulfilled. The statue is nearly complete. The rock is already falling. And Iran, ancient Persia, the silver arms of destiny, is about to discover what every empire learns in the end, that there is only one kingdom that will never be destroyed, and only one king whose reign will never end. The question echoing through eternity is simple. When the rock falls, where will you be standing? He saw the clouds before the nations ever gathered. In the silence of exile, beside the waters of Babylon, where harps hung mute on weeping willows, a prophet named Ezekiel was granted a vision so terrifying, so precise, that 25 centuries later, generals and scholars still whisper about it, in the war rooms of nations. The year was 593 BC. Jerusalem lay in ashes. The temple was rubble. God's people sat in chains, wondering if their covenant had died with their city. But in that darkest hour, heaven pulled back the veil of time itself. And what Ezekiel saw was not just the restoration of Israel. He saw her final test. Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. The voice of the Almighty thundered through the prophet's spirit, like a war drum echoing across eternity. This wasn't just another oracle of judgment. This was the unveiling of the last great battle, the final storm that would gather against the apple of God's eye. But here's what will shake you to your core. In that ancient vision, as Ezekiel's trembling hand wrote down the names of nations that would one day rise against Israel, one name burned across the parchment like fire: Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. There it was, written in the sacred text before Iran ever existed as a modern nation, before nuclear weapons, before proxy wars, before chants of death to Israel echoed through the streets of Tehran, the same land that once sent Cyrus to rebuild Jerusalem, the same empire where Esther saved her people from extinction, was destined to march in the final coalition against the very nation it once delivered. Do you see the divine irony, the horrifying poetry of prophecy? God used Persia to restore Israel. But in the end times, Persia would rise to test her survival once more. You will advance against my people Israel, like a cloud that covers the land. Ezekiel didn't see tanks rolling across desert sands. He didn't see fighter jets screaming through Middle Eastern skies, but he saw something far more terrifying. He saw a spiritual storm, a demonic confederation so vast, so unified in hatred, that it would darken the earth like an eclipse. And at the heart of that storm, the Prince of Persia, the same territorial spirit that Daniel encountered in prayer, the same dark authority that delayed heaven's messengers for 21 days. That principality never died. It never retreated. It simply waited for the appointed time when ancient Persia would become modern Iran, and the spiritual war that raged in Daniel's day would manifest in flesh and blood on the mountains of Israel. In that day, when Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. But here's where the vision turns from nightmare to revelation, because what Ezekiel saw wasn't just the gathering of the storm. He saw its destruction. He witnessed the moment when human rebellion crashes against divine sovereignty, like waves against an immovable rock. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops, and on the many nations with him. The same God who once used Persia as his instrument would become Persia's judge. The same divine hand that guided Cyrus would break the bow of Iran, not through human strategy, not through diplomatic negotiations, but through supernatural intervention that would leave no doubt about who truly rules the affairs of nations. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. This is why the vision matters. This is why Ezekiel wept as he wrote it down. The coming war isn't just about land or politics or nuclear weapons. It's about the revelation of God himself. The final demonstration to a watching world that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still sits on the throne of the universe. Every alliance forming today, every proxy war being fought, every missile being manufactured, every threat being whispered in the corridors of power. They are all just pieces moving across a chessboard that God designed before the first king ever took a throne. When you see Iran funding Hezbollah, remember Ezekiel 38. When you watch Russia growing closer to Tehran, remember the names written in the scroll. When the world calls Israel the aggressor, remember that this gathering storm was prophesied 25 centuries ago by a man who had never heard of nuclear weapons or proxy militias or cyber warfare. The nations are taking their positions exactly as the prophet saw them. the same geographical regions, the same spiritual alignments, the same supernatural hatred burning in human hearts. But don't let the darkness of the vision overshadow its light. Because Ezekiel didn't just see judgment. He saw vindication. He witnessed the moment when God would defend his people so powerfully, so unmistakably, that the whole earth would tremble in recognition of his sovereignty. On that day I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, in the valley of those who travel east of the sea. It will block the way of travelers, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. The storm Ezekiel saw was never about Iran's victory. It was about God's glory. The gathering clouds were never about Israel's destruction. They were about her vindication. The final test was never about the strength of the coalition. It was about the faithfulness of the one who promised that Israel would never be completely destroyed. What if every headline screaming from your television screen is simply another verse of Ezekiel 38 being fulfilled? What if every diplomatic failure, every broken ceasefire, every escalation of tension is just the appointed time drawing near? The prophet saw the clouds before the nations ever gathered. He wrote their names before their governments were ever formed. He described their defeat before their weapons were ever forged. And still deeper, the scrolls whisper of judgment and mercy. In Jeremiah's vision, Elam did not stand. The prophet sat in the dust of exile, his eyes heavy with tears that had carved rivers down his cheeks. Around him, the rubble of Jerusalem still smoldered. The temple lay in ashes. God's people scattered like leaves in a hurricane. And yet, in that moment of deepest darkness, heaven opened again, not with comfort, with thunder. The word of the Lord came to me concerning Elam, Jeremiah wrote, his hand trembling as divine fire coursed through his veins. But this wasn't just another prophecy about another distant nation. This was about the land we now call Iran, and what God was about to declare would echo through 25 centuries, landing like lightning in today's headlines. Listen to the voice that shook the prophet's soul. I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. I will bring against Elam the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. I will scatter them to the four winds, and there will not be a nation where Elam's exiles do not go. The bow of Elam. Do you understand what that meant? In the ancient world, Elam was renowned for one thing above all others: their archers. Their composite bows could pierce armor at distances that terrified armies. When Elam's bowmen took the field, kingdoms trembled. Their arrows flew like judgment itself, swift and merciless. The bow of Elam was their crown, their pride, their very identity. And God said he would break it, not chip it, not bend it, break it, shatter it, turn their greatest strength into splinters and dust. But here's what will shake you to your core. As Jeremiah penned these words of divine judgment, he was seeing something that wouldn't unfold for centuries. He was watching the rise and fall of an empire that hadn't even been born yet. The Elamites would merge with the Medes and Persians, creating the very empire that would one day conquer Babylon. They would become part of the kingdom that God himself would use to restore Israel. Yet even then, even in their hour of divine purpose, the prophecy remained. The bow would be broken. Fast forward through the corridors of time. Watch as Persia rises under Cyrus, as Esther saves her people in the Persian court, as the Magi from the east follow a star to worship the newborn king. But also watch as that same Persian soil slowly hardens its heart. Watch as the spirit behind the throne shifts from servant to adversary. Watch as the land once used to restore Zion begins to plot its destruction. Today, when Iran's leaders boast of their missiles, their nuclear capabilities, their ability to rain fire upon Israel, they don't realize they're fulfilling an ancient prophecy. The modern-day descendants of Elam still trust in their bow. Only now it's not arrows of wood and iron, it's rockets and warheads and the technology of destruction. And still, the prophecy whispers across the ages, I will break the bow of Elam. But Jeremiah wasn't finished. In the depths of that vision of judgment, something extraordinary happened. The prophet's tears began to shimmer with an impossible light, because after declaring Elam's destruction, after prophesying their scattering, after promising that their bow would be broken, God spoke one more word. One word that changes everything. Yet in the days to come I will restore the fortunes of Elam, declares the Lord. Did you catch that? The same breath that pronounced judgment also promised redemption. The same scroll that declared war also whispered peace. The same God who would break their bow would one day restore their broken heart. This isn't political commentary. This is prophetic mystery. How can a nation be judged and redeemed in the same prophecy? How can the very people destined for divine wrath also be destined for divine mercy? Because that's who our God is. He is the God of the second chance, the third chance, the 70 times 7 chance. He is the God who breaks what is proud and restores what is penitent. He is the God who scatters in judgment and gathers in mercy. Right now, as you sit reading these words, there are believers in Iran risking their lives to worship Jesus in secret. There are house churches blooming in the very soil that once hosted the courts of Haman. There are former Muslims bowing their knees to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the land that now threatens to wipe Israel from the map. The bow is being broken, but from its splinters, altars are being built. Could it be that the very nation most hostile to Israel today is also destined to become part of Israel's greatest revival? Could the land that now echoes with chants of death to Israel one day ring with songs of holy, holy, holy? The prophet saw it. In the midst of judgment, restoration. In the midst of scattering, gathering. In the midst of the broken bow, something beautiful being rebuilt. But don't mistake this for cheap grace or easy reconciliation. The prophecy demands judgment first. The bow must be broken. The pride must be humbled. The threats must be silenced. Only then, only when human strength has been exhausted and human arrogance has been crushed, can divine mercy flow. Iran's leaders today stand exactly where ancient Elam once stood, trusting in their bow, boasting in their might, threatening God's people with their arrows of destruction. They don't realize they're reading from a script written 25 centuries ago. They don't understand that their very defiance is fulfilling the prophecy that promised their downfall. The bow will be broken. It must be broken, because sometimes the ruins make the clearest altar, and sometimes the greatest revivals rise from the ashes of the greatest judgments. What breaks your heart isn't the coming judgment. What breaks your heart is the possibility of what comes after. A people scattered to the four winds, finding their way home to the God they never knew they were looking for. A nation that once threatened to destroy God's people becoming part of God's people. A bow broken in judgment becoming an altar built in worship. Jeremiah saw it all. The tears, the judgment, the scattering, but also the restoration, also the gathering, also the day when Elam's exiles would return not as conquerors, but as children. The scroll is still unrolling. The prophecy is still breathing. And somewhere in the sovereign heart of God, both judgment and mercy wait their appointed hour. Because sometimes, the very nation that God must break is the same nation he plans to rebuild. The star-rosanned Persia remembered Daniel's scrolls. 6 centuries had passed since Daniel knelt by the waters of Babylon, writing visions that would outlive empires. 600 years since Persian kings had walked through the corridors of prophecy, unknowing vessels in the hands of the Almighty. The great Persian Empire had crumbled beneath Greek swords. The glory of Cyrus had faded into memory. The palaces of Susa lay in ruins. But in the eastern reaches of what was once Persia, in chambers lit by oil lamps and heated by sacred fires, old men still studied ancient scrolls. They were the Magi-priest astronomers, keepers of wisdom, guardians of secrets passed down through generations of Persian nobility. And among their treasured texts were copies of writings left behind by a Hebrew exile named Daniel. These were not mere stargazers. These were the intellectual heirs of an empire that had once moved at the whisper of the God of Israel. Their ancestors had served in the courts where Daniel interpreted dreams and Esther saved a nation. They carried in their bloodlines the memory of kings who bowed to the Hebrew God, even without fully knowing him. And then, the star appeared. Not just any star, a herald, a cosmic announcement written in fire across the vault of heaven, and these Persian sages, these students of Daniel's prophecies, recognized it immediately. They had been waiting, watching, calculating the times and seasons according to scrolls that spoke of a coming king, a Messiah, a light that would dawn from Zion. Daniel 9:25 had given them the timeline. From the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. They had done the mathematics of prophecy. They had counted the years, and when that star blazed forth in the eastern sky, they knew the king had come. Picture the scene that followed. These were not poor wanderers. These were men of wealth, of influence, of royal lineage. Yet they abandoned their palaces, their comfort, their very kingdoms to follow a star across hundreds of miles of desert wasteland. They loaded their camels with treasures fit for divinity itself, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they began a journey that would become the most famous pilgrimage in human history. But here's what shakes the soul. They weren't just following a star. They were fulfilling a pattern written into the very fabric of prophecy. Just as their Persian forefathers had once funded the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple, now their descendants were coming to worship the living temple God made flesh, lying in a manger in Bethlehem. The irony is breathtaking. While Herod, the supposed king of the Jews, plotted murder in his palace, Persian sages were crossing deserts to worship the true king. While the religious leaders of Jerusalem sat unmoved, just 5 miles from Bethlehem, foreign priests from the east were prostrating themselves before the Christ child. Matthew 2:2 captures their declaration. Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. Not to negotiate, not to forge political alliances, not to seek favor or advantage, but to worship, to bow, to acknowledge the sovereignty of one their prophet Daniel had foretold. And so the scrolls fall silent, but not because the story has ended, only because this chapter has closed. From the dust of Eden to the headlines of today, we have traced a thread so golden, so ancient, that it spans the very breadth of eternity. We have watched as God's hand moved through the rise and fall of empires, through the courts of kings who never knew his name, through the prayers of exiles who trusted his promises even in foreign lands. Persia, Iran, the same soil, the same people, yet wearing faces as different as mercy and judgment, as deliverance and destruction. We have seen her in her glory when Cyrus the Great, a pagan king, carried the title of God's anointed and funded the rebuilding of Jerusalem's temple. We have witnessed her in her courage when Queen Esther risked everything to save her people from annihilation. We have marveled at her worship when Persian magi crossed deserts to bow before the Christ child, bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But we have also glimpsed her darkness, the same spiritual principalities that once delayed angels now breathing through regimes that vow to wipe Israel from the map. We have read the prophecies that name her among the armies of Gog and Magog, marching against the mountains of Israel in the latter days. 2 faces, 2 destinies, 2 possible endings to an ancient story. But here is what should shake us to our very souls. We are not reading history. We are living prophecy. Every news alert from the Middle East is another verse coming to life. Every diplomatic crisis, another seal being broken. Every threat and counter-threat, another page turning in the book that Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah wrote with trembling hands. The question that haunts the darkness of these closing moments is this: could it be that Persia's final chapter has not yet been written? Could the same land that once sent wise men to worship the Prince of Peace find its way back to that star? Could the descendants of Cyrus remember what their forefathers once knew about serving the God of Israel? Scripture whispers of a day when the nations will stream to Jerusalem not in war, but in worship. When former enemies become eternal worshipers. When swords are beaten into plowshares and the knowledge of the Lord covers the earth as the waters cover the sea. But before that day dawns, the fire must fall. The prophecies must be fulfilled. The final confrontation between light and darkness must play out on the stage of human history. And ancient Persia will stand at the center of it all. You who are watching tonight understand this. You are not spectators in some distant drama. You are witnesses to the unfolding of eternity. The same God who moved through Persian courts 2.5 millennia ago is moving still. The same Spirit that guided Hebrew exiles through Babylonian captivity is guiding you through these prophetic days. The times are not random. The tensions are not accidental. The alliances and betrayals, the threats and counter-threats, the missiles and the prayers, all of it was seen, all of it was written, all of it was planned by the one who sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. So when you see Iran in tomorrow's headlines, remember Persia in yesterday's prophecies. When you hear threats against Israel, remember Esther's courage and Daniel's prayers. When the world trembles at the possibility of war, remember that the God who controls the outcome has already written the ending. Watch, pray, discern the times, but do not fear, because the same God who once used Persia to deliver his people from exile is still writing his story of redemption. The same God who protected Israel in the courts of ancient kings is protecting her still. And the same God who turned Haman's gallows into the place of his own execution can turn any plot against his chosen people into their ultimate deliverance. The scrolls are closing, but the story continues. The prophecies are ancient, but they are breathing still. And somewhere in the heart of modern Iran, perhaps in the whispered prayers of underground believers, perhaps in the dreams of those who have never heard his name, the same God who once sent a star to guide Persian sages may be preparing hearts once again. Because in God's economy, judgment is never the final word. In God's hand, even ashes can become altars, and Persia's flame may rise again this time, not in war, but in worship. The king is coming. The prophecies are unfolding. And you have been chosen to watch. Watch, therefore, for you know not the hour